We had a fantastic launch of the playbook last couple of weeks ago now. I think a number of you were able to join us. And we're really excited to dive into this series of sort of instructional sessions where what we want to do is dive into discrete sort of chunks of the playbook each week, sort of give you a bit of the thumbnail from our perspective, how and why we put this together as a resource, and open the floor and create a forum where we can sort of discuss with you the contents, answer any questions you might have around how you can use it with your teams, and mostly try and sort of build a community around this really important resource. So I will introduce myself and ask my colleague Gina to introduce herself in a second. The most important thing to do first is to welcome you guys and orient you to how we're going to use the session, how we'll spend our next hour together. So a couple of brief notes. I always want to disclose that we do record these sessions for folks who can't attend. This will be available as a resource after the fact, so always want to make you aware. We've tried to sort of pass out the time we have together today to allocate a good amount of time for questions. So as we sort of move towards the more discussion-based section of our agenda, as Gina and I are presenting, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A function that's available to you, and we'll be referencing that for our discussion. Also, the really nice thing about being live is being able to ask your question live. So if when we get to Q&A, you'd like to ask your question, if you raise your hand using the Zoom function, we'll unmute you and we'll have a proper discussion, which will be wonderful. And then, as I said, we're recording today, so both slides and the recording itself will be available after today's session, both on the DIME website and on the Playbook website. So how are we going to spend our time today? We'll do some introductions. I'll spend just a couple of minutes doing a quick refresher on the Playbook. Then I'll kick us off with a couple of thoughts, perhaps provocative, to seed some thinking for our discussion around what is the case for digital clinical measures? Why did we build this whole playbook around them? Why are we so passionate about them? And what do we think that they can bring to the healthcare space? How can they improve lives? Then I'm going to hand off to my colleague Gina to talk a little bit about sort of the opportunity right now and today to really intentionally shape this field of digital clinical measurement and remote monitoring going forward. As promised, we will devote a good chunk of time to our Q&A, and then I won't bore you towards the end, but what I will do is as we close, I will just do a quick reminder on next steps for the playbook, how you can get engaged, and also give you a heads up on what's coming next in our masterclass series. So again, welcome everyone. We're delighted you're here and really excited to have this first masterclass session with you. Gina, do you want to go ahead and start by introducing yourself to everyone on the line?
Sure. Thanks, Jen. I'm Gina Valo. I'm a Presidential Innovation Fellow. Background noise, as we predicted. I'm a Presidential Innovation Fellow working at FDA. I've been in this role for about a year. I come from a private sector tech background. My experience is primarily in software delivery and implementation and data integration. And so I don't come necessarily from a traditional healthcare background, and my involvement in the playbook has really been from the perspective of a technologist. And that being said, I sit at FDA in the office of Dr. Amy Abernethy, Principal Deputy Commissioner and Acting Chief Information Officer, where I work on a variety of initiatives related to the Technology Modernization Action Plan, particularly related to use of data internally and externally and real-world data sources. So it's great to be here. Thanks, Jen.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gina. My name's Jen Goldsack. I'm the Executive Director here at the Digital Medicine Society. DIME was thrilled to be one of the co-leads on the first draft of the playbook, along with our colleagues at Electra Labs, Genentech, Connexa, Myocardia, Sage Bionetworks, and Scripps Research. And of course, Gina, your really important contributions through sort of your vantage point as both a tech expert and your current role over at FDA. So it was a pleasure to work on all of this with you, and sort of proud to continue this through the masterclass. So let's start for folks who either couldn't attend a couple of weeks ago, or perhaps a busy 2 weeks has passed and we should do a quick refresher on the playbook. Really, our goal here was to create a single source of truth, what we're describing as the essential industry guide for successful remote monitoring, critically importantly, across the different contexts of use of clinical research, of clinical care, and public health. What we wanted to do was to create a shared foundation for how we think about these measures across these different settings. And as we think about why digital clinical measures, we'll tease out some of our thinking around why it was so important to us to think across these different settings. Before we dive in, I mentioned all of the tremendous collaborating organizations who are part of this. I want to recognize them again, along with some funding from Genentech and Myocardia that made this possible. And we're really excited as we go from the launch of the playbook into this phase of driving adoption to be adding more and more names to this list. We really see this as a sort of collaborative initiative, and we're really delighted that you're all here with us today. And the playbook, I think it's really important to think about this not necessarily as a brand new piece of work or stake in the ground, but rather our goal was to say, you know, what are the barriers to really moving remote monitoring ahead, digital clinical measures ahead? We've done an awful lot of work here at DIME, really trying to provide resources to the field to advance this kind of work. But you know, as we try and support sort of a $3 trillion industry just domestically, before we even look at the global healthcare industry, it's never going to be one organization that does this. And how could we bring together, how could we stitch together all of the many fantastic resources that exist that tackle in depth sometimes really specific considerations within the field? How could we bring them together? How could we, one, create sort of a one-stop shop, that toolkit where you could come and access what you need when you need it? And how could we present it in a way that was action-oriented to really make it as easy as possible for you guys to develop and deploy high-quality digital measures of health? So that was our goal with the playbook. I'm really proud of what we achieved, but I want to make sure that we recognize the work of our colleagues across industry, across regulatory regions that we brought together as we prepared and as we built out the playbook. And our goal was really to think about digital clinical measures as a way of evaluating health that transcends these boundaries of clinical care, of clinical research, of public health, to really think about the lived experience of a condition or the presentation of a symptom, not sort of regarding that setting. So why should the measures? We really wanted to advance a field where we weren't thinking about a Pfizer measure of health, a Takeda measure of health, a CDC measure of health, a Mayo Clinic version of health. We wanted to really have a common source of truth. And when we came to build the foundation, it became clear to us that we needed to be really intentional about our approach. We couldn't start with the widget or with the gadget, or we couldn't start with a bold plan that we were going to deploy this in hundreds of people, but we had to think about what are we going to measure and why? What's the best technology, if indeed technology is the right solution to support this? And then how do we operationalize it, not just to ensure measurement success and monitoring success, but to ensure things like equity, to ensure things like justice in their deployment. All of this was on our mind. We were really thrilled, and Gina might comment on this later. I was optimistic about the common foundation we would find across these contexts of use, but I was really pleasantly surprised to see how much common ground there was around developing and deploying high quality measures. And then as we pass out the particular considerations for a research setting, for a care setting, for a sort of public health setting. Obviously there are specific considerations, but there really is this huge sort of common foundation that we describe in the playbook along with those specific considerations. As I said, the sort of intentionality around moving from measures that matter to high quality technologies to sort of thoughtful operations are at the heart of the playbook. Also promoting a culture of ethics, thinking about the process of benchmarking, identifying the needs for standards and developing them in a really sort of thoughtful and parsimonious way. And also, you know, healthcare is a highly regulated environment. How do we think about this work in conversation with existing regulations and policy? And how can all of you on the line get involved? All of that we tried to put into the playbook as a resource for you. So That was a whistle-stop tour of a 400-slide deck. I'm sure that many of you on the line have accessed that resource. If you haven't, it's available at playbook.dimesociety.org. It's there as a living resource. It will be maintained, and we will go through section by section all of the content throughout the fall in this Playbook Masterclass series. And how we wanted to start this series was less around, you know, here are the action-oriented bullets, but more around why on earth is this important to us at all? Why are we passionate about digital clinical measures? What do we believe they can do? And why is it so important to us to be intentional around how we develop them and deploy them? What are the potential risks? So I'll spend just a couple of minutes sharing some of my thoughts on that. And then we'll circle back to these, and I want to hear from you and learn from you all during our discussion after Gina's remarks. So there's one way to look at it, right? Which is there's a ton of money being pumped into this. If you look at some of the statistics, this is pretty wild. Over 500 billion going into digital health globally by 2025. And absolutely that's happening. That's not what makes me passionate, although I understand that that investment needs to happen in order for us to get success. In addition to sort of dollars and cents, we know that our colleagues in the press have very correctly, in my opinion, identified that this is a real moment in sort of a transition to digital approaches. Our colleagues at Stat News reported, again, I agree with them, that healthcare is undergoing a monumental shift towards remote patient monitoring. I think that's been driven by COVID. I'd also argue that there are challenges that warranted this kind of transition long before the pandemic hit our shores. And sadly, I think some of those pressing and persistent challenges will persist even beyond the current public health crisis. But I do think they are exactly right, that this is a particular moment in the evolution of our field where there's so much movement. And some of that is not just driven in terms of dollars and cents, but also in terms of the technology. It's pretty wild, actually, if we reflect over the last few weeks. 3 of the 5 biggest companies in the world have offered up a variety of different remote monitoring products. We can look at Amazon, who launched their Halo, their sort of, it's a wellness band and a companion app that was launched at the end of August. We can look to our colleagues at Google, which obviously sits under Alphabet. They were cleared by the FDA and actually got a CE mark on Europe on the same day, on September 11th, specifically for their ECG app. And then on September 15th, Apple hosted a virtual launch day, and the vast majority of that conversation was around health and wellness products. And one of the sort of jewels in that crown were some of the remote sensor technologies embedded in their new Apple Watch 6. So we are replete with a variety of different technologies we can use in service of digital clinical measurement and remote monitoring. What I think is really important, though, we can look at the dollars flowing in, we can look at the media buzz, we can look at all of these technologies, and it is exciting, but we mustn't be tech determinists, and we mustn't allow this sort of moment, the business case, while critically important, the very existence of this technology to drive what we're doing. And so I wanted to share a couple of things that always make me pause when I'm thinking about what are we actually doing here? What are we trying to champion as we do the, frankly, hard work that goes into successful development and successful deployment of these measures. I think about the example of the cancer patient who needs a bone marrow transplant. I'm not sure if folks on the line know, but in the last few months, I've learned that patients waiting for a bone marrow transplant have to go in 5 times to the clinic before their transplant, simply to have their vitals measured to ensure that they're stable. This, to me, seems, frankly, cruel and unusual. We have all of the capabilities we need to do those tests, which are very warranted, but to monitor the stability of the patient from home. We can do all of that from home without making their care partner take more time off to bring them in, without the cost and the expense and the exhaustion that comes with travel, without the burden to the family, to the friends, the costs. We can do all of that perfectly well from home in a much more patient-centric way that gives us exactly the same quality of information to care for that cancer patient through their bone marrow transplant. Another example that always really gets me is the current gold standard in a disease called Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is the 6-minute walk test. So for folks who might not be familiar with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, this is a neurodegenerative disease. Typically, it affects boys and young men. Typically, they start showing symptoms between about 4 and 6 years of age. By the time they're 10 or 11, typically the natural history of this disease is that these boys are in a wheelchair, and unfortunately life expectancy is still devastatingly low. Most of these boys and young men pass away by their early 20s. And when we think about the current gold standard in how we monitor their care, the progression of their disease, and how we make decisions about the effectiveness and the value of new drugs that could help them, is we use this test, the 6-minute walk test. And what kind of gets me about that is we bring these boys with their parents, we take them out to school and we bring them into the clinic for as long as they can complete that test. And when we can't, we don't even have a gold standard measure for them. When we're developing drugs, we're not targeting the population that's already wheelchair bound because they can't complete the gold standard test. I think about the fact that these are sort of tween and teenage boys. This test doesn't measure whether they can text their friends, whether they can play computer games, whether they can complete their homework, feed themselves, take themselves to the toilet, maintain their dignity as like young boys. And the possibility to use things like a wrist-worn sensor that can measure really easily how well they're doing with their computer games, texting their friends, capture all of those things that are really important to them without pulling them out of school and bringing them into the clinic. It just seems so compelling and so important. And these, to me, are the use cases around digital clinical measures. We can do much better by the patients that we are all here to serve if we are more thoughtful and more creative about how we measure their health, including taking that outside of the clinic and into their home. The last one, just while I pile on a bit here, is this is a lovely picture of some folks who sadly have Parkinson's disease. They're participating in some physical therapy. But what many folks may not know is that 40% of Parkinson's patients in the US live with their disease and pass away without ever seeing a neurologist. Their condition is never assessed by an expert, despite the fact we know it can have hugely impactful effects on their outcomes. And so I think about the challenges to that. Is it time? Is it cost? Is it discrepant or mismatch in place between the neurologists themselves and the patients who need that visit? Remote monitoring can be a powerful tool in bridging that gap and providing information about a Parkinson's patient life to a neurologist that they might not otherwise be able to interact with. And so these are the sort of use cases when I think about sort of how digital clinical measures can really transform how we understand health, how we really understand the lived experience of a patient's disease, while also making the way we measure it much more patient-centric. And there's a lovely slide that's in the playbook, and it was adapted from our colleagues at Evidation Health that I also think sort of provides a compelling use case. Currently, when we bring patients into the clinic and we measure them sort of during an appointment, whether that's a study appointment in research or whether it's as part of their routine care, we have these tiny little snapshots of how they're getting on that can be influenced in a number of ways. When we start to think about doing remote monitoring and the much greater insights we can make into the patient's experience, we not only get better information for sort of immediate decision-making and care, but we start to develop this broader sort of body of evidence that's much more complete, that we can really probe to greater understand disease, both for the patient in front of us and for the broader population. The one pause I have there is, for that to be truly valuable, we really have to make sure that the data that we're capturing is high quality. So there's huge opportunity here, but one of the things that I'm really excited about in the playbook is not only to advance the use of technology where it's appropriate, but also to think about doing it in a way that the information we get is really high quality and thus really valuable to sort of medical decision-making and to the patients themselves. And the last thing I'll say before I hand over to Gina is that the value in the way we can use digital data is one of the many reasons that we thought about looking across these different use cases: clinical research, clinical care, and public health. If we are serious about starting to use real-world data in medical product development, if we are really serious about championing sort of learning health systems, if we're really serious about being truly prepared when a pandemic hits our shores, we need to have high-quality, consistent measures across the board. And so I think being really intentional about doing that is critically important. And I think there's such a good reason to do it. Data doesn't live in manila folders in a file cabinet anymore. Arguably, once it's digitized, it should be more accessible. So let's make sure that information, that data that we can access, that we can do these population level studies on, is actually high quality. So that's me on my soapbox for a bit. That's why I am so passionate about this field. That's why I'm excited to be sort of talking with you all and learning from you. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Gina. I'll stop sharing as you talk to us all about sort of the opportunity we have today to intentionally shape the field. And if I remember correctly, Gina, you've got a really powerful story to share with us all.
Thanks, Jen. And you teed it up perfectly with the theme of intentionality, because that is exactly what we're going to touch on. So let me, let's see here. I lost your screen and now I need to share mine. All right. And can you see my screen?
Perfect.
Excellent. Great. So like you said, the intentionality really sort of teed this up perfectly for me. So Jen, when you asked me to talk about why this work matters, my mind jumped to some of the really complex issues we're facing in the diagnostic space within the context of the evidence accelerator, which I'll speak to in just a minute, and why we want to avoid creating a similar situation with these newer digital technologies. This is going to be a bit of a cautionary tale based on some of these things that I've uncovered lately, which won't be new to many of you on this call. But we've been working very closely with the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA as participants in their evidence accelerator, which is helping us to answer some critical public health questions within the context of COVID-19. So if you haven't gotten enough of this, or you're unaware for some reason, there is a global pandemic happening. We will be talking about it because we can't not. And in this space, we're trying to understand some of the real world performance. Specifically, there's a research question we're looking at around the performance of antibody tests or serology tests by manufacturer. And we've been working with really brilliant industry partners, but many of whom are still struggling to find the manufacturer test data. And as you can imagine, that data exists. There is a manufacturer. It does exist in systems, but these systems aren't talking to each other. And that's one of the things that, as I talk you through this example, this sort of simplified illustration of a very complex problem, I want you to keep in mind how this is a parallel to the digital health space and why a tool like this playbook would be so important here. Imagine, as I talk about the systems at play for the diagnostic space, the various databases and movement of data, as you might imagine it, between researchers, technology companies, regulatory bodies in the context of the digital health space. And we'll bring it all back together at the end, but bear with me as we kind of dig into a COVID-specific diagnostic story. So this story is about a single person who has had many COVID tests. Meet Heidi. She has had a tough couple of months, and we're going to trace her story from left to right around the circle. And we're going to start from back in April when Heidi wanted to get tested before visiting her grandmother. So she goes to a nearby parking lot drive-through and gets tested. And then in June, she's having a outpatient procedure. So she goes to her primary care physician for the required screening test before that procedure. And then in June, Heidi develops some mild symptoms of COVID-19. So she goes to urgent care where she's tested again. And then several days later, the symptoms get more severe. She goes to the emergency room where she's tested again. She's admitted to the hospital where she's tested several more times. And then thankfully, Heidi recovers and she decides that she wants to get tested for antibodies, hoping to donate plasma. She's tested, and after an initial negative result, she's tested again. So 2 more tests on the serology side. But this is not a story about Heidi. It is a story about Heidi's data. And each step along this journey, Heidi's interactions generate a mix of structured and unstructured data. And throughout this story, you're going to see a filled-in circle symbolize the completeness and usability of structured data, like a clinical test result of positive, and an open circle to indicate unstructured data. Think like a clinical note that might explain why the patient sought care. And while this story, again, was created to talk about diagnostics, I'd like for you to imagine that during this time, Heidi maybe also was using various sensors and wearables that were continually tracking her heart rate and temperature and pulse oxygen level, and where that data might fit into this story as we walk through it. So we're going to take a closer look here at the data generated from Heidi's second test. So specifically the outpatient procedure that was performed at our primary care physician's office, or the test in advance of her outpatient procedure. And here, this is a sampling, we'll call it, there's 10 data fields here. Obviously, there's many more data elements when we were talking about electronic health record data and testing data. But just as an example, each circle here, the green circles represent data originating in the electronic health record. The dark blue circles show data that originated in the lab information system. So that's sort of like an EHR that a lab would use. And then a light blue circle represents data originating on a testing device or instrument where the test is run. And then the red exclamation point shows that data that's not captured at all anywhere. And an important takeaway here is that data are created at every step in this testing process. And some, but not all, will move between these different systems. And as it moves, it can change from structured to unstructured, say, as a pathologist is reading a test and then manually entering that data. So now we're going to take a look at this procedure, or this test for this procedure on the map. So first, just want to point out, as you go from the outside in, this outer ring here represents the instrument itself, data that is originated in the instrument itself. And then the middle is for the lab information system, and this green area is representing the electronic health record. And you can see that on the outer edge of the circle, data is very highly structured as it's created on an instrument, or maybe a sensor if we're thinking about it in that respect. And it tends to become unstructured as it moves inward and closer to the patient level. And we have in the lab information system relatively little green data or patient data, but it's slightly more structured. And as we move into the electronic health record, we have much more patient data, but much more unstructured data. When we look across all 9 of Heidi's tests, we see different patterns in movement of data, all changing based on various providers, labs, devices, all of these different elements at play. And Heidi's left a very messy trail of data behind with no single system capturing the full story. And if we look at data just from Heidi's primary care physician in their electronic health record, we're able to connect a few pieces of the story. But if we look at the urgent care EHR, we can only see a single piece of the puzzle. And if we look at the hospital EHR, we see another subset of results. And then even if we had all of the data from all of the EHRs and this green level, we would still be missing a fair amount of data from the upstream pieces, what's happening in the lab and what's happening on the instruments themselves. And if you're not overwhelmed yet, we have to remember that Heidi is just one patient. And there are millions of Heidis with their own messy arc of data. So this is, of course, a story and a sort of overview of the data interoperability challenge in a nutshell. And I think we all know data is hard. Systems are hard. Getting these things to play together is really difficult. And we know that even if we can connect the data, it's not always structured and it's not always complete. And also, just for a little bit more detail here, between each of these systems where these lines connect are other layers of middleware each with their own configurations and capabilities and limitations. And so there's a very large technical ecosystem at play here that it makes it difficult, because we're now in this position where we're limited in our ability to make sense of the information, despite the fact that the technology and the data exist. It's really about being able to get them in the same place to ask important questions. So why does this matter? Why am I talking about diagnostics in the context of digital clinical measures? The answer is because there's a very real risk of a very similar story unfolding in digital health and the digital clinical measures. There's lots of different players. There's lots of different places data exists, is created, is moving. And there's really good news here, which is that this is the very, very beginning of the story. There's an opportunity here to be really intentional about how these systems are designed, how we're collaborating within and across industries, and how we're coalescing around standards that are going to help us, ultimately drive the best outcomes for patients. And so from my perspective and the work that I've been doing and the challenges that I've seen, I'm really grateful to have been part of this process of talking about the playbook, which really gets down to the brass tacks of how do we start to do this in a coordinated fashion. If I'm throwing a cheesy metaphor out there for Jen's sake, how do we start rowing in the same direction? It's really important that we really think about this and we do this deliberately and intentionally, so that all of this brilliant data that we are creating is usable and can move quickly without us stepping on our own toes along the way. So with that, I'm really excited to be a part of this effort, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jen.
Fantastic. Gina, that was really terrific. And I think that sometimes we can lose a little bit of sight of the opportunity we have on deck right now to be incredibly intentional about how we do this, to try and head off at the pass, sort of exactly the kind of situation you described here. We are early enough, but to get this right is going to require us to be intentional. And let's throw another cheesy little saying and showy and pulling together. So with that, I had a placeholder slide for Q&A, but let's not do that. Let's throw it open to questions from those of you on the line. Just a reminder, I'm taking a look at both the Q&A function, there's a chat function, and if you'd like to raise your hand, I can also keep an eye on that and unmute you if you'd like to ask a question directly. And I'm never afraid of the long pause, but while folks sort of think about the questions they want to pose, Gina, maybe I can ask you a question. Coming in with a sort of a background, being a tech expert, and sort of coming to this truly sort of transdisciplinary space where we need to have this kind of common unifying language and this common idea of what good looks like. How can we better communicate some of these considerations to our colleagues coming in from the tech sector? There's so much terminology, it's such a highly regulated space. How can we use a tool like the Playbook and other tools to really sort of make it easier for them to land and be impactful here in the sort of medtech space?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, coming from the outside into government, before I was ever a fellow, before I was ever, working at FDA, it was such a mystery to me. How do things get done? Who do you talk to? How would you even, interact or consider that sort of perspective from a regulatory standpoint, let alone, all of the other pieces that are involved in this effort. And my thinking on it is, a lot of times when it feels really difficult, people tend to disengage, right? We see a lot of, from a technology perspective, of this, we're just going to build it, move fast, break things, and, we'll clean up our messes later, and, ask for forgiveness instead of permission. And I think that helps move things faster, but I do think it is a byproduct and of sort of an inability to easily access clear and concise information. There's a lot of government speak. There's a big initiative, you know, for using plain language. It's really important. And I think this is where nonprofits and public-private partnerships can be really, really helpful. I mean, I think I said this on the last conversation, but the partnerships we have really help bridge that gap in terms of having, you know, conversation and really talking through some of these things from a government and regulatory perspective. And then from a broader sort of technology development perspective, the playbook, I think, is a really great example of how to communicate very clearly to those who would implement these measures or consider these things from a data infrastructure and technology perspective. It's really about getting that message out there. And I think it's one of the reasons I'm really excited about this playbook, because it does really simplify this. It makes it easy to digest, and then also easy to get involved and follow up, I think, from an accessible organization where you can engage and interact. But it's a hard problem. I don't think there's a magic bullet. I think we need to create materials that are not sort of 100-page Word documents, but are really sort of dynamic, living, breathing materials. And then also, you know, tools and technologies that technologists are comfortable with, you know, where things are being created and shared on GitHub, for example, sort of meeting people where they're at and where they like to share information and get information, I think, is also really important in bridging that gap.
That's a terrific answer, and I love the meeting people where they are. I think that's the only way that we're going to make people feel comfortable and sort of welcome them to this sort of collaborative process. A couple of really good questions coming in. There's one in the Q&A, Gina. I'm going to let you take a first whack at it, and then we've got a few questions coming in the chat as well, which I do see and we will get to. So from in the Q&A, what are the possible ways to link the unstructured data with the structured data? And I thought that question might come up as you were presenting the story, so I'll let you have it, that one.
Sure, absolutely. I'm sorry, I'm like clicking around. I'm desperately trying to stop seeing my own face on Zoom. It's a great question. So this is one of the things we're working on constantly, and you know, in the context of this project, we're working a parallel analysis group of 7 different organizations that are each solving it in their own way. So some are they are their own lab system on site. It's a large healthcare facility, and they have a lab in their own environment where they're able to understand or even just make a phone call and figure out what are the manufacturers being used and sort of fill in those gaps, all the way to really sophisticated data aggregators, which I think provide a really interesting, and there's many different models of them, and you've got health exchanges, and, you know, we're sort of looking at it from all angles. But you know, some of the ways that you do that, there are commercial data aggregators out there that do use various, you know, tokenization and other technologies to help connect data across various platforms that have very sophisticated natural language processing to make sense of some of the written notes and the context and that sort of thing. But these are not free or cheap technologies. We're very lucky to have really good partners in that sense. And then there are other things that we talk a lot about, where things like a universal patient identifier, universal device IDs, the LOINC codes, for example, have been extremely helpful. But interestingly, no one thing in isolation can really connect the pieces in the ways that we need them. You sort of need all 3, and maybe then some more information. And so it's a huge challenge. You know, some of the ways are using some of these other commercial tools, and sometimes it's really a matter of starting small and contained in a system and a set of data where you can fill in some of those gaps manually and learn from the process. And so we're very much in that early learning stage right now about that. But I would say my best recommendation here is to try to avoid some of these things where, where data is being generated from devices and sensors. The more that we can agree on standards and ways of capturing that data, what data you need to capture, and it is important, and you're doing that from the beginning, it's a lot easier than trying to make sense of it or scrape it from a note or a comment or something like that later on. So time travel is probably the best way to link these things, if I could.
And I mean, it was a great question and a really terrific answer, Gina, but I think it really underscores your remarks earlier about us taking seriously sort of the opportunity we have on deck right now, specifically thinking about sort of digital clinical measures and being intentional. And how can we set up sort of systems that, to the extent to which we can avoid going down these pathways where we need to do sort of patch up jobs in the future. We've got a good number of questions pouring in, actually, so I'm going to take a couple from the chat and then I'm going to jump back to the Q&A. So Heather Black in the chat asked a really good question. How do we find a unifying language when we're spanning such a fragmented system between manufacturers, clinical providers, IT, and patients? Heather, I'll take a quick crack at that and then I'll see if Gina has any additional remarks. I think what we've been talking about around meeting people where they are is actually one of the core values we have here at Dime. And certainly when I think about some of the work we've done to try and advance a common language, even around something as seemingly simple about what's digital health, medicine, what's a digital therapeutic, all the way through to the V3 framework that you guys will have seen in the playbook around thinking about verification, analytical validation, clinical validation. We did a couple of things. One, meeting people where they are and recognizing all the people who need to be at the table to come up with that unified vision. So in coming up with the V3 framework, for example, that's in the playbook, drawing on a previous publication, we made sure we had folks from different regulatory regions. We made sure we had hardware engineers, software engineers, that we had data scientists, that we had folks with a wet lab background, that we had folks from sort of the payer side, that everyone was together, even a few folks with like a genetics background that thought differently about the sort of validation process and hashing that out. And that was a really hard project. We had 16 co-authors on the original V3 paper, and we had some hard conversations in the meetings. And it really came down to how can we extrapolate the sort of background expert knowledge that these disciplines have, the lexicon, the language that they have, and create a common unifying language that they can map onto and that they are part of. So that's been our strategy. And definitely type some comments, folks, if it seems like it's working well or not, or if you have questions. Gina, you must do a lot of herding cats and trying to come up with common language in your work at FDA. What strategies have you guys found productive?
Yeah, so in the small parallel analysis group, it's much more manageable because we're not talking about a huge group of people. But there we've been very deliberate about communicating and writing down and documenting when we say this is what we mean. And we've had a ton of help from very skilled folks at the Reagan-Udall Foundation really guiding that process. The other thing that comes to mind for me is sort of the comment I made towards the end of our last meeting around this being a public good, and that like all public goods, if you don't take care of it or we take it for granted, it can become less meaningful. And so I would say the way that we continue to have a shared language around this is to continue to give feedback on what's working and what's not, especially what's not, because when something doesn't work, when we're not on the same page or we're not using the same language around things and we're not recognizing that, we just start to do our own thing and do what works for us. And so it's really closing the loop on those things, bringing them back and saying, I've heard this called this, or are these things really different? Or, I think feeding that information back into this is so important for us to continue to maintain a resource that is living and breathing and not sort of a relic of August 2020 or September 2020. It's really important that we keep it alive and keep adjusting to what people are hearing and using and saying and how that's changing over time.
Fantastic. I'm going to quickly field Heather's quick follow-up question, and then Smit, I'm going to go to your question. So Heather, how much time does it take to get that kind of agreement? How many years? So with the work that we've done so far, whether it was V3 that was Dime-led or whether it was this more collaborative sort of playbook, we've been trying to sprint. We recognize that this is a field that's moving very quickly. The V3 project, we met weekly for 4 months and we knocked it out. And we had those hard conversations often. Our goal at Dime is to do clinical quality work on a tech timeline, recognizing that we have an opportunity to be intentional, as Gina described, and we want to jump on that. I think the challenge, and again, this is why I'm so delighted to have everyone on the line, is, you know, we can come to that sort of a critical mass, as we see it, of agreement, and then it's driving adoption. And so I think things like the playbook, things like you guys getting involved with us on the call today are really important. Gina, really terrific question from Smit around the technology modernization action plan. So thinking about that, let me see if I can get this right. Currently, the connected sensor and wearables data falls under the non-regulated HIPAA policy. So first of all, is that correct? And second, how can we think about what this means to different stakeholders and how we'll protect that rich patient data when the sort of privacy protections are a little bit unclear. And Smit, I'll unmute you. And if I absolutely butchered that question, then please chime in.
I think it was perfect, Jen. You did it perfectly.
Just now and again. Gina, what are you thinking? I know that your boss, Dr. Abernethy, has really been leading the charge with the TMAP. How do you think about these sorts of questions and the use of this new data?
Yeah, so I will preface this by saying I'm definitely not the person you want answering policy questions. But I can say, you know, as it stands right now, you know, these are consumer protections, which is tough, right? It leads to a lot of, you know, confusion or lack of clarity around, you know, and that is, you know, again, I'm not the expert on this, but my understanding is when it comes to certain sensor data, like an Apple Watch, for example, that data is not HIPAA protected data. That data is consumer protected data. Which is, you know, falls under an entirely different policy. So what does it mean? I'm rereading your question here. What does it mean to different key stakeholders? How will it protect that rich patient data? You know, I think there's a, I think we're ripe for new policy when it comes to this type of data and where the line is between consumer data and private health data. If it's being used in, you know, a clinical setting, for example, now you have a, you know, a sort of FDA approved device collecting data, but that device isn't necessarily regulated by these same things. Like, I think it's really complicated. I don't personally have the answer to that. But I do think it presents an interesting challenge, and I think, you know, one that we're going to have to solve in order to really advance this field, and especially to get people to comfortably participate in these things and feel that their data is protected. I'm not sure if this fully answers your question. I'm also not certain I'm an expert in what you're asking. So if you have any follow-ups, I'm happy to dig in a little deeper with you.
I think this was great. I was just curious about starting the conversation around having those consumer data, specifically, like what are those lines? How can we have more participations from patients who are using those connected sensor data? And if we are going towards the whole new era of decentralized clinical trials, how we can protect those patient data. And I think it's a great platform to start talking about it. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, the playbook touches on ethics. There's a whole section on it. And I think that's certainly, you know, when it comes to influencing how we think about this from a policy perspective and HIPAA versus consumer protections, et cetera, there's a really, this is where, you know, Dime and other organizations can play a really important leadership role in sort of soliciting feedback from researchers and clinicians and participants. And, you know, I think it's in a conversation we need to have at a pretty broad level. And it's certainly going to influence how this field evolves.
Gina, that was a really terrific answer, and I'm going to jump around a little bit between the questions coming in. Stuart Morton asked a really good question around in the Q&A about sort of when we're trying to entice patients to sort of share all of this data, including from sort of remote monitoring technologies, like how do we do that? And I think that, you know, Smith identified perhaps some gaps around what's protected. And I really think it comes down to really trying to shore up and perhaps even re-earn trust in all of this. So trust that, you know, what we're measuring is important, and we're not just sort of harvesting information from participants or from patients, that, you know, we safeguard it, and that wherever it can be reused for good, it is, and it's protected when it is. But I think it comes down to sort of very broad brushstrokes, you know, really sort of building trust in this ecosystem, and whether the data is coming from sort of sensor products or whether we are sort of consolidating other data sets. In the absence of trust, I certainly wouldn't share my data, and I wouldn't expect anyone else to do so. So I think that's the foundation. Gina, I'm going to keep jumping around. There is a question from Christian that I'll take a first smack at, and then it's yours, and then we'll move over and we'll take a question from Samal. So Christian asked, and actually, let me see if I can find you, Christian, and unmute it, because you have a really nice story in here that I think might be nice to share. Christian, if you're able, do you want to give voice to your question?
Sure, this is Christian. I assume is the first one about I kind of layered two, but one was essentially that there's a bit of a comment about the complexity of interoperability, and that one of the most important design aspects is to take into account the responsibilities of clinicians to be able to interpret data quickly and accurately, because they take on the liability of a patient's care. And one of the most meaningful conversations I had with a doctor about it was, you know, there's data everywhere, but what I really need is dashboards to be able to help me make better decisions. And so I wonder, I wanted to hear any comments about that. Separately, I guess I had a second question about the big three tech companies, and if there was any take on, if there's anyone espousing or especially passionately defending the rights of patients to truly own their data and be able to port it as they see fit, since we live in a system that has so many different points of access and so many different ways they have to be able to carry their own data around.
Gina, why don't I grab the dashboard question to start? So Christian, really terrific remarks, thank you. I think one of the things that we outline in the clinical care section of the playbook, but it applies throughout, right? An investigator with responsibility over their participants. You're exactly right. These huge streams of data sort of flowing in and that aren't sort of human readable aren't going to be useful to anyone. If we really want to support our clinicians who are already hugely overburdened in terms of their administrative responsibility, we really need to think about creating really high value, fit for purpose, sort of, just as you say, sort of dashboards for these information. I often think about what we can learn from our sort of genetics colleagues. The whole genome isn't dumped into the EHR, right? But key findings are. And how can we sort of potentially maybe use that model, and keen for your feedback on that if you have ideas. I also think that in order to have a dashboard perhaps, or create flags in data that would signal a response within a modified workflow, we actually need to understand what this like normative values for different patient populations, for different measures, measuring sort of aspects of health, if not continuously, then high frequency and outside of the clinic. We're starting to see some evidence, whether that be temperature, whether that be blood pressure, that we're getting different bands to what we see during these snapshot measures in the clinic. So what I think is really important, and where I think there's huge opportunity for pre-competitive collaboration, is to quickly try and establish what sort of normal looks like, where the flags lie, to allow us to create high value dashboards for sort of clinicians to meaningfully interpret the information they're getting.
Yeah, I think that distinction too between data and information is really critical, and definitely makes sense why you don't just want a stream of, you know, my Apple Watch data flowing right into your EHR. And you know, the opposite is also, you know, a problem. You know, I think about some of the things that we've seen during COVID and that has really shed a light on what's not working from an industry perspective as well is, you know, this sort of long process of, you know, scientific experiments and then publication and writing and waiting for those things to get published, where like we need, you know, this data is moving much faster than that, and our insights and information and learning is moving much faster than that. And how do we surface that information, but with the right caveats at the right time to the right people? And that's, you know, some of this is really, you know, starts in some of the more scientific experiment realm and the clinical trials and things that can inform this, but there is other just sort of patient care considerations as well, where, you know, this is an important question to be posing to technologists, and to kind of tie it back to the playbook, which is if we're calling things the same thing, and we're developing technologies that use data in similar ways and call things and have the same, you know, same sort of way of referring to things, we will move much faster when it comes to building tools that allow you to visualize that data if the data are in much more similar and standardized formats to start with. So that, you know, from a data perspective, I think this goes back to, you know, to get that tool and to get those dashboards, we have to, the data has to all be usable and on the same page. And and that's where I think the playbook really helps start that conversation. How do we get to that world so that we can build these kinds of tools quickly and easily?
Fantastic. Christian, thank you for a terrific question. I'm just looking at the clock. I'm really disappointed. I don't think we're going to get to the rest of the questions. I wish we had more time to continue the discussion. For folks who are Dyn members, let's plan to continue this in our Slack. You can get both me and Gina there. You can ping us. We can put it in the Q&A channel. This is a really wonderful discussion, and I'm grateful to all of you for participating. Just as we wrap very quickly, and Gina, can you just confirm you can see my slides?
I can.
Okay, lovely. Just a couple of notes on where we are with the playbook. So it's available for you at playbook.dynsociety.org. We will be doing, and Heather had a great question about how we tackle these things. We're going to pursue our mission of clinical quality work on a tech timeline. The next tour of duty will be 4 to 6 months, running from October through to April. We are building that next cohort. We really want to think about refining the content of the playbook, really making it as accessible as possible to have impact, and also driving the broad adoption. We'll be sharing these slides, and you can sign up for that again at playbook.dynsociety.org. There's the timeline that I just described. You can also share your feedback asynchronously. We've got a form on the website where you can let us know how we're getting on with the playbook as you start to use it with your teams, what's working, what's not, what do we need to think about perhaps a little bit differently based on your experience. And then the last thing, this is the first masterclass in our 4 series. So Gina, you are absolutely brilliant. I love co-presenting with you. Thank you everyone for dialing in. This was such a terrific discussion. And session 2 of our 6-session series is this time next week. So it's 3 o'clock Eastern next week on Tuesday, October 6th. Where our colleagues from the Playbook team, Christine Manta, Andy Korovos, and Chris Benko, are going to be taking you through sort of the foundations of digital clinical measurement. Why is it so important that we start with the measure, that we move to tech, that we move to ops? I hope we've convinced you today that these digital clinical measures have huge value when they are developed and deployed intentionally. We are excited to be working with you. Gina, thank you for everything. Thank you everyone on the line. And I look forward to continuing to advance the playbook with you. Bye everyone.